In 1775, the most powerful empire on Earth faced a problem it did not take seriously. Across the Atlantic Ocean, 13 small colonies were growing restless. To British leaders in London, these colonies were valuable, but weak, dependent on British trade, protected by British soldiers, and governed under British authority. There was no scenario where these colonies could truly challenge the British Empire. At least, that was the belief. Britain had defeated powerful European kingdoms. It controlled trade routes across the world, and its navy ruled the seas without equal. Against such power, how could farmers and merchants possibly resist? From London, the answer seemed obvious. They couldn't. What followed would become one of the greatest miscalculations in history, because Britain did not lose to a rival empire. It lost to a people it never fully understood. A people who were not fighting only for land, but for identity, for independence, and for something even more dangerous: belief. Before the revolution began, Britain stood at the height of its global power. Its influence stretched across continents, from Europe to India, from the Caribbean to North America. The empire had recently defeated France in a massive global conflict. Victory had expanded British territory and prestige. To British officials, this confirmed what they already believed. The empire was unstoppable. The American colonies were seen as a distant extension of that success. Useful, profitable, but ultimately dependent. Few in London believed the colonists possessed the unity or the courage to challenge imperial authority. This assumption would shape every decision that followed, and it would prove disastrously wrong. Inside the colonies, a different reality was forming. The people living across the Atlantic were no longer thinking of themselves simply as British subjects. They had built communities from nothing. They had survived harsh winters, distant supply lines, and constant uncertainty. They had learned to rely on themselves more than on any distant king. This quiet independence was not obvious to those in London, but it was growing stronger with every passing year. Colonial merchants traded across oceans. Farmers expanded into new lands. Local assemblies governed towns and regions with increasing confidence. What Britain saw as dependency was slowly transforming into self-reliance. What Britain saw as loyalty was quietly turning into distance. And what Britain believed was control was already beginning to fade. Tensions began to rise after years of costly wars. Britain had accumulated enormous debt defending its empire. Leaders in London believed the American colonies should help pay for that protection. New taxes were introduced, not as punishment, but as policy. From Britain's perspective, it was reasonable. From the colonies' perspective, it was a warning. For the first time, many began to question who truly held power over their lives. The Stamp Act of 1765 was one of the first major sparks. It required colonists to pay taxes on printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. To British officials, it was a simple financial measure. To the colonists, it felt like control without representation. They had no elected voice in Parliament, yet they were expected to obey its demands. The issue was no longer about money, it was about authority. Protests erupted across the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts. Crowds gathered in the streets. Political voices grew louder. Britain saw these actions as temporary unrest, the complaints of distant subjects who would eventually comply. But something deeper was forming beneath the surface. A shared identity. A growing belief that decisions affecting colonial lives should not be made an ocean away. British leaders underestimated how quickly ideas could spread. Pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches carried revolutionary thinking from town to town. Local assemblies debated rights and freedoms. Ordinary citizens began to see themselves not just as colonists, but as participants in a larger cause. Britain still believed authority would prevail. It did not yet understand that authority was already being questioned. Each new tax and regulation strengthened colonial unity. What had once been separate regions with different interests slowly found common ground. Resistance networks formed. Committees communicated across colonies. For the first time, distant communities began acting with shared purpose. Britain saw isolated protests. In reality, a connected movement was emerging, one that would soon become impossible to control. In London, Confidence remained high. British officials believed firmness would restore order. They assumed colonial resistance would fade once authority was enforced. After all, the empire had faced unrest before. It had always prevailed. To them, the colonies were divided by distance, culture, and economy. Unity among them seemed unlikely. That belief would shape the next series of decisions. Troops were sent to maintain stability. Their presence was meant to discourage rebellion and reinforce imperial control. Instead, it created tension. Soldiers and civilians lived side by side in crowded cities. Every encounter carried the weight of growing mistrust. What Britain viewed as protection, many colonists viewed as occupation. The distance between ruler and ruled widened with each passing day. The Boston Massacre in 1770 became a defining moment. A confrontation between British soldiers and colonists turned deadly. Shots were fired. Lives were lost. News spread quickly across the colonies. For many, the event confirmed their fears. British authority was no longer distant or abstract. It was present, armed, and capable of force. Britain saw an unfortunate incident. Colonists saw a warning. Despite rising tensions, British leaders still believed reconciliation was possible without major concessions. They expected colonial resistance to weaken over time. Trade pressure, military presence, and political authority would eventually restore balance. What they failed to recognize was how deeply the idea of independence had begun to take root. Not everywhere, not all at once, but steadily. Colonial leaders started to coordinate more openly. Communication networks strengthened. Meetings between representatives of different colonies became more frequent. These discussions were not yet calls for full independence, but they revealed a shared concern. If rights could be limited once, they could be limited again. Many began to believe that long-term security required something greater than temporary compromise. By the early 1770s, the relationship between Britain and the colonies had fundamentally changed. Trust had eroded. Assumptions of loyalty were fading. Britain still believed authority would hold. But in towns and cities across the Atlantic, a different belief was spreading, that the future of the colonies might not lie within the empire at all. In 1773, a new decision from London would push tensions even further. The British government granted the East India Company special privileges in colonial trade. To Britain, it was an economic solution. To many colonists, it looked like manipulation. Local merchants feared losing their businesses. Citizens feared growing control. Once again, policy created resistance rather than stability. In Boston, frustration reached a breaking point. One night, a group of colonists boarded British ships carrying tea. They emptied entire cargoes into the harbor. The event became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was not only an act of protest, it was a direct challenge to British authority, a public statement that obedience was no longer guaranteed. The British response was swift and severe. New laws were passed to punish Massachusetts. Ports were closed. Local governance was restricted. Troops were increased. In London, these measures were meant to restore order and demonstrate control. But across the colonies, they produced the opposite effect. Many who had remained neutral began to reconsider their position. Colonies that once saw Massachusetts as distant now saw themselves reflected in its situation. If one colony could be punished so harshly, any colony could face the same fate. Sympathy turned into solidarity. Committees of correspondence strengthened. Leaders communicated more frequently. A sense of shared destiny began to form. Britain still believed pressure would divide the colonies. Instead, it united them. By 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress was not yet a declaration of independence. It was a meeting of concern and coordination. Delegates debated rights, authority, and the future of their relationship with Britain. Even then, many hoped for reconciliation. But they also began preparing for something else. Across towns and countryside, local militias quietly organized. Supplies were gathered. Training increased. These preparations were not always open or official, but they were real. Britain viewed the colonies as subjects protesting policy. In reality, they were slowly preparing for conflict, a conflict that few believed could be avoided much longer. By early 1775, the tension between Britain and the colonies had reached a fragile and dangerous point. British commanders received orders to monitor colonial activity closely. Reports had reached London that militias were gathering weapons and organizing resistance. To British leadership, this was not yet a rebellion, but it was moving in that direction. They believed decisive action could prevent a larger conflict. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Massachusetts, was instructed to seize colonial military supplies stored in nearby towns. The objective was simple: remove the weapons, weaken the militias, and reassert control without provoking widespread war. British leaders believed a show of force would end resistance quickly. They still assumed most colonists would avoid open confrontation, but the colonies were watching closely. Networks of riders and informants tracked British troop movements. When British soldiers began marching toward Lexington and Concord, word spread rapidly through the countryside. Local militias prepared to meet them, not as a formal army, but as organized communities ready to defend what they believed were their rights. At Lexington, in April 1775, British troops encountered colonial militia for the first time in open formation. No one knows exactly who fired the first shot, but once it was fired, everything changed. What began as an operation to seize supplies became the first armed conflict of the American Revolution. A moment that neither side had fully planned, yet neither could reverse. The British troops continued toward Concord, where they faced stronger resistance. Colonial militias used the landscape to their advantage. They moved through fields and forests, striking from positions that traditional European tactics struggled to counter. British forces completed their mission, but faced relentless attacks during their return to Boston. The message was clear. This would not be a simple show of force. For the first time, British leaders realized they were not facing scattered protests. They were facing organized resistance capable of sustained conflict. Still, many believed the rebellion could be contained. They assumed superior training, discipline, and resources would quickly restore order. Once again, Britain underestimated the determination forming across the colonies. News of the clashes spread rapidly. Across the 13 colonies, communities reacted with urgency. Militias mobilized. Supplies were gathered. What had once been political tension was now armed resistance. The possibility of reconciliation began to fade. In its place, a new reality emerged. A war had begun, even if no one had officially declared it. In the months that followed, colonial forces gathered around Boston. What began as scattered militias slowly formed a coordinated resistance. Farmers, craftsmen, and volunteers stood alongside experienced fighters. They lacked formal training and consistent supplies, but they shared a common purpose. To British commanders inside Boston, the situation was unexpected. They had anticipated unrest, not a sustained military presence surrounding the city. The British still believed their professional army would quickly regain control. Reinforcements arrived from across the Atlantic. Warships filled the harbor. Discipline and experience remained on Britain's side. Yet outside the city, the colonial forces continued to grow. What they lacked in uniformity, they made up for in determination. Many were fighting for their homes, their communities, and a future they believed was now uncertain. In June 1775, tensions erupted again at the Battle of Bunker Hill. British forces moved to secure strategic high ground near Boston. Colonial fighters had already fortified positions. When British troops advanced, they expected a swift victory. Instead, they faced fierce resistance. Waves of soldiers marched uphill under heavy fire. The battle was costly and brutal. The British eventually secured the ground, but at a heavy price. The losses shocked British leadership. They had won the field, yet the cost revealed something troubling. Colonial fighters were not retreating easily. They were capable of holding positions and inflicting serious damage. For many British officers, this was the first clear sign that the conflict would not end quickly. Still, they believed time and resources would eventually decide the outcome. Meanwhile, the colonies took a crucial step. In July 1775, representatives gathered again in Philadelphia. The Continental Congress established a unified army. George Washington was appointed as its commander. Washington was not the most experienced officer available, but he possessed something equally valuable: discipline, composure, and the ability to unite diverse colonial forces under a single command. Washington understood the reality facing his army. They were outmatched in training, equipment, and organization, but they possessed advantages of their own. Knowledge of the land, shorter supply lines, and a population increasingly committed to resistance. He knew victory would not come from a single decisive battle. It would come from endurance, from patience, from survival. Britain still believed the rebellion could be crushed with one overwhelming demonstration of force. But the conflict was already evolving into something different. A long war of persistence. A test not only of armies, but of will. And in that test, the outcome would depend on who could endure the longest. As the war expanded beyond Boston, both sides began to understand the scale of what lay ahead. Britain prepared for a large, decisive campaign. Its leaders believed that a powerful military display would break colonial resistance quickly. More troops were sent across the Atlantic. Experienced generals were placed in command. The strategy was clear: end the rebellion with overwhelming force before it could fully organize. For the colonies, survival remained the immediate goal. The Continental Army faced constant shortages. Supplies were inconsistent. Training varied widely. Many soldiers served for short periods before returning home. Yet despite these challenges, the army remained intact. Washington focused on discipline and unity. He knew that if the army collapsed, the revolution would collapse with it. Keeping the force together became the priority. In early 1776, the British turned their attention to New York. Its location made it strategically vital. Control of the city would allow Britain to divide the colonies and isolate rebellious regions. British forces arrived in great numbers. Warships filled the harbor. Thousands of trained soldiers prepared to engage. Against such strength, colonial defenses appeared fragile. Once again, Britain believed victory would be swift. Washington recognized the danger. He positioned his forces across Long Island and Manhattan, hoping to delay British advances. But British troops were highly trained and well supplied. In the summer of 1776, they launched a powerful assault on Long Island. The Continental Army was outmaneuvered and forced to retreat. For a moment, the revolution stood on the edge of collapse. Defeat seemed close, yet Washington made a critical decision. Instead of risking total destruction, he ordered a strategic withdrawal. Under cover of darkness and fog, American forces evacuated across the East River. It was a quiet, disciplined escape that preserved the army. Britain had won the battle, but not the war. Once again, British commanders believed the rebellion was weakening. They did not realize how close they had come to ending it completely. Through the autumn of 1776, American forces continued to retreat across New Jersey. Morale fell, enlistments expired, supplies ran low. Many believed the revolution might not survive the winter. British forces advanced with confidence, expecting the remaining resistance to dissolve. To them, it appeared only a matter of time before the colonies accepted defeat. But Washington was preparing for a moment that would change everything. As winter approached, the situation for the Continental Army grew increasingly fragile. Soldiers lacked proper clothing. Food was scarce. Many had not been paid. Enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year, threatening to dissolve what remained of the army. British commanders believed the rebellion was nearing its end. They assumed one more push would break American resistance completely. Washington understood the danger. If the army disbanded, the revolution would collapse. He needed a victory. Not a large victory, but a symbolic one. Something that could restore belief and prove that the American cause was still alive. He began planning a bold and risky operation, one that relied on speed, surprise, and determination rather than numbers. On the night of December 25th, 1776, Washington made his move. In freezing conditions, under darkness and wind, he led his troops across the Delaware River. Ice filled the water. The crossing was slow and dangerous, but by morning, American forces reached the town of Trenton. There they launched a sudden attack against Hessian troops supporting the British. The victory at Trenton was small in scale, but enormous in impact. It proved that the Continental Army could still strike effectively. It revived morale. Soldiers who had considered leaving chose to stay. Confidence began to return. Britain saw the attack as a minor disruption, but for the colonies, it was something more. Proof that the revolution was not finished. Days later, Washington struck again at Princeton. Once more, speed and surprise worked in his favor. British forces were pushed back. These victories did not end the war, but they changed its momentum. The revolution had survived its most dangerous moment. Britain still possessed superior resources and manpower, but the assumption of an easy victory was beginning to fade. From this point forward, British strategy began to shift. They realized the conflict would not end quickly. Suppressing the rebellion would require sustained effort, coordination, and time. Yet even as plans evolved, a fundamental misunderstanding remained. British leaders still believed the colonies could be subdued through force alone. They underestimated the growing resilience of the American cause. By 1777, British leaders designed a new strategy to end the rebellion. They believed that by isolating New England from the other colonies, they could weaken the heart of resistance. The plan focused on controlling the Hudson River. If British forces secured this route, they could divide the colonies and cut communication between them. From London, the strategy appeared precise and effective. Victory seemed within reach. General John Burgoyne led the main British force south from Canada. His army was well equipped and confident. Early advances went according to plan. Forts were captured. Territory was secured. British leadership believed the colonies would soon lose their ability to coordinate. But as Burgoyne moved deeper into unfamiliar land, his situation became more difficult. Supply lines stretched thin. Local resistance intensified. American forces adapted quickly. Instead of direct confrontation, they disrupted British movement. Roads were blocked, supplies were intercepted, communication slowed. Burgoyne's army advanced, but at a cost. Time and resources began to run out. Meanwhile, American forces gathered strength. Under the command of General Horatio Gates, colonial troops prepared to challenge the British advance near Saratoga. The battles at Saratoga marked a turning point. American forces, reinforced by local militias, surrounded Burgoyne's army. After weeks of pressure and limited options, the British commander surrendered in October 1777. The news traveled quickly across the Atlantic. For the first time, a major British army had been defeated and captured. The outcome stunned observers in Europe. For France, the victory changed everything. Until that moment, France had watched the conflict cautiously. Supporting the colonies carried risk, but Saratoga demonstrated that the American cause had real potential. Soon after, France formally allied with the United States. This decision transformed the war from a colonial rebellion into an international conflict. Britain now faced not only American resistance, but European opposition. The British Empire had misjudged the scale of the revolution. What began as an effort to control distant colonies had grown into a global war. Resources would now be divided. Attention would be stretched. And the assumption that the rebellion could be crushed quickly was no longer realistic. The conflict had entered a new phase, one that would test Britain's endurance as much as America's. The alliance with France changed the balance of power. French ships, supplies, and soldiers began supporting the American cause. What had once been a struggle for survival now gained international strength. For Britain, this created a new challenge. The war was no longer limited to the colonies. It extended across oceans and continents. British resources had to be divided to defend global interests. British leaders adjusted their strategy once again. They shifted focus to the southern colonies, believing support for the crown was stronger there. If they could secure the south, they hoped to isolate remaining resistance in the north. Early campaigns showed promise. Cities like Savannah and Charleston fell under British control. Once more, British commanders believed victory was within reach. But controlling territory proved different from controlling people. In the countryside, resistance continued. Local militias used knowledge of the land to their advantage. Small mobile forces disrupted British movements. Supply lines were attacked. Communication became difficult. The war in the South turned into a series of exhausting engagements rather than decisive battles. Britain held cities, but struggled to secure the surrounding regions. American and Allied forces adapted to this new phase. Leaders understood that time was becoming their ally. As long as the army remained intact and resistance continued, British costs would rise. Washington avoided unnecessary risks. He focused on maintaining pressure and preserving strength. Each year the war continued, British support at home faced greater strain. By the early 1780s, British forces under General Cornwallis moved into Virginia. There, they hoped to establish a strong position and regain control. Instead, they found themselves increasingly isolated. American forces tracked their movements. French naval power limited escape by sea. Gradually, British options narrowed. The situation that unfolded would become the final decisive moment of the war. In 1781, American and French forces surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown. Land and sea routes were blocked, supplies diminished, reinforcements failed to arrive. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis faced a reality Britain had tried to avoid since the beginning. Continuing the fight was no longer possible. In October, British forces surrendered. The moment signaled the effective end of the war. The surrender at Yorktown did more than conclude a military campaign. It confirmed what had once seemed impossible. A collection of colonies had resisted the most powerful empire in the world and survived. Britain had misjudged the determination, unity, and resilience forming across the Atlantic. What began as a conflict over policy ended as the birth of a new nation. The war officially moved toward its conclusion after Yorktown. Negotiations began between Britain and the American representatives. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris formally recognized the independence of the United States. The empire that had once viewed the colonies as dependent subjects now acknowledged them as a sovereign nation. It was a result few in London had considered possible just years before. For Britain, the loss forced reflection. The empire had possessed superior numbers, greater resources, and global dominance, yet it had failed to understand the mindset forming across the colonies. British leaders had measured power in ships, soldiers, and wealth. They had underestimated belief, distance, and the willingness of ordinary people to endure hardship for a cause they believed in. For the United States, the victory established more than independence. It created a national identity built on resilience and persistence. The revolution had not been won through overwhelming strength. It had been won through survival, adaptation, and strategic patience. Again and again, the American forces had avoided destruction, regrouped, and continued forward. Looking back, the American Revolution became one of history's most significant miscalculations. Britain did not expect the colonies to unite. It did not expect them to endure long-term conflict. And it did not expect foreign powers to join against it. Each assumption shaped decisions that ultimately worked against British success. The story of the Revolution is not only about battles and treaties. It is about perception, about how one of the most powerful empires in history misread a distant population, and how that misunderstanding allowed a new nation to emerge, a nation that would go on to shape global history in ways few could have imagined in 1775. The world believed the American experiment would fail before it truly began. But against expectation, against probability, and against the judgment of the era's greatest empire, it endured. And in enduring, it proved something that would echo far beyond its borders. Sometimes, the greatest turning points in history begin with a simple mistake, the moment a rising nation is misjudged. The American Revolution did more than create a new nation. It revealed something the world had failed to understand. America was not defined by size, wealth, or military power. It was defined by resilience, by the ability to endure uncertainty, defeat, and doubt, and continue forward. When Britain looked across the Atlantic, it saw scattered colonies. What it failed to see was a people already learning how to survive without dependence. The Revolution forged a mindset that would shape the United States for centuries, a mindset built on adaptation. When resources were limited, Americans adapted. When defeat seemed near, they reorganized. When the future looked uncertain, they moved forward anyway. This ability to recover, to adjust, and to continue would become one of the defining strengths of the nation. Many revolutions in history burn intensely and disappear just as quickly, but the American Revolution endured because it was not driven only by anger or rebellion. It was sustained by long-term belief, a belief that a nation could exist where power came not from a distant crown, but from the determination of its people. That belief became stronger with every challenge faced and survived. From the frozen crossing of the Delaware, to the endurance of harsh winters, to the final victory at Yorktown, the story of the American Revolution became a story of persistence. It proved that power alone does not decide the future. Understanding, unity, and resilience can reshape history in ways that armies cannot predict. The British Empire misjudged more than a military threat. It misjudged a mindset. It misjudged a population willing to endure years of uncertainty for the chance to define its own future. And in doing so, it helped create a nation that would grow far beyond what anyone in 1775 could have imagined. The United States was not born as the strongest nation in the world. It was born as the most underestimated. But from that moment forward, one lesson would repeat itself across history. When America is tested, it adapts. When it is doubted, it endures. And when it is misjudged, it finds a way to prove the world wrong. This is America Misjudged, when the world got America wrong. This is America Misjudged, when the world got America wrong.